In the dead of night, February 1970, something impossible was happening in the Vietnamese jungle. Dead soldiers were speaking. Their voices, tormented, desperate, echoed through the darkness, begging their comrades to abandon the fight and return home. Vietnamese troops, hardened by years of combat, fled their positions in terror. But these weren't ghosts. They were Americans, and fear was their weapon. This is the story of psychological warfare, the invisible battlefield, where minds are conquered before bullets are fired, where inflatable tanks fool entire armies, and where the line between truth and deception becomes a weapon more powerful than any bomb. War has always been about more than firepower. Ancient commanders understood something fundamental. Break the enemy's will, and you break their ability to fight. But it wasn't until the 20th century that psychological warfare became a science, a deliberate, calculated weapon wielded with the precision of artillery. The story begins in January 1918. The First World War had consumed Europe for nearly 4 years. Millions were dead. Empires were crumbling, and the United States, newly entered into the conflict, realized they needed more than soldiers and steel. On January 23, 1918, the U.S. Army established its first dedicated psychologic operations capability, 2 agencies designed specifically to influence enemy minds. Under the Military Intelligence Branch, Major Charles H. Mason commissioned Captain Heber Blankenhorn to establish the psychologic subsection. His mission? To weaponize information itself. President Woodrow Wilson opposed military propaganda, so Blankenhorn worked in secrecy, walking the halls of the War Department, pitching an idea that seemed absurd to traditional military minds: leaflet warfare. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of only destroying the enemy, why not convince them to give up? Why not make them question their cause, doubt their commanders, fear their fate? By the war's end, Allied forces had delivered over 50 million leaflets in modified artillery shells and bombs dropped from airplanes across the Western Front. German generals later admitted that this psychological assault had devastated their troops' morale, proving that fear and doubt could be as lethal as bullets. But after the Great War ended, America forgot this lesson. The psychological warfare units dissolved. The knowledge gathered dust in classified files. It would take another global conflict and a charismatic visionary to resurrect the art of psychological operations.
June 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day, a peculiar unit arrived in Normandy, one that would help win World War II without firing a shot. They were artists, fashion designers, sound engineers, painters, radio operators. They carried paintbrushes instead of bayonets, and they were about to fool the entire German army. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Dost Army, was the first mobile, multimedia tactical deception unit in U.S. Army history. 1,100 men with a singular, impossible mission: make the Germans believe that 30,000 American soldiers existed where there were none. Their arsenal was unlike anything the world had seen. Inflatable tanks that could be erected in minutes, dummy artillery pieces made of rubber and canvas, fake radio chatter, sound trucks that blasted recordings of armored divisions, noises that could be heard 15 miles away. Among them were future fashion designer Bill Blass, photographer Art Kane, and painter Ellsworth Kelly, men recruited not for their marksmanship, but for their creativity. Led by Colonel Harry L. Reeder, the Ghost Army staged traveling road shows of deception. They would roll into an area, inflate their rubber tanks, blast their sonic recordings, transmit fake radio signals, and create the illusion of an entire armored division preparing for attack. From a distance, the illusions were perfect. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed what appeared to be massive Allied buildups. Intelligence officers scrambled to redirect troops. Commanders second-guessed their strategies, all based on rubber and smoke and sound. When a gap opened in General Patton's line during the attack on Metz in September 1944, the Ghost Army held the precarious line for 7 days, with nothing but their inflatables and loudspeakers, playing sounds of rumbling tanks and shouting troops. 7 days, against the Wehrmacht, with fake equipment. One soldier recalled the absurdity. 2 Frenchmen on bicycles accidentally wandered past our perimeter. They weren't looking at me, they were looking over my shoulder at 4 GIs picking up a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. The deception was remarkably effective. When 2 actual 9th Army divisions crossed the Rhine on the night of March 23, 1945, they met little resistance because German forces were positioned miles away, convinced by the Ghost Army's illusions that the attack would come from a completely different location. The Ghost Army participated in 22 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. 3 men were killed. Around 30 were wounded, but military historians estimate they saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. After the war, these men were sworn to secrecy. Their records were classified. For more than 40 years, even their families didn't know what they'd done. It wasn't until 1996 that their story was declassified. In 2022, they were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. The Korean War had ended. The Ghost Army had proven that deception could win battles. But one man would take psychological warfare into darker, stranger territory, a place where folklore became a weapon and fear became as precise as a sniper's bullet. His name was Edward Geary Lansdale, and he would change the nature of modern warfare forever. Lansdale wasn't your typical military officer. Born in Detroit in 1908, he struggled with foreign languages at UCLA and dropped out before graduating. He worked in advertising, learning the psychology of persuasion, how to sell ideas, how to manipulate emotions through imagery and narrative.
Then, World War II came. Lansdale joined the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and discovered his calling, psychological warfare. In 1950, the Philippines was burning. The Hukbalahap rebellion, communist-aligned guerrillas who had fought the Japanese during the war, now threatened the American-backed government. Conventional military force wasn't working. The Hooks knew the terrain, had popular support, and operated from dense jungle hideouts. President Elpidio Quirino personally requested that Lansdale be transferred to the Philippines to combat the Hukbalahap rebellion. Lansdale arrived with a different strategy entirely. He didn't want to outfight the Hooks. He wanted to terrify them. His first innovation was psychological, the Eye of God. At night, PSYOPS teams would creep into villages and paint an ominous, all-seeing eye on walls facing homes of suspected Hook sympathizers. The message was clear: someone is watching you. Someone knows. The eyes appeared overnight, like dark magic. Villagers awoke to find them staring from adjacent buildings. The notion of an omniscient, malevolent presence created paranoia that spread faster than any military campaign. But Lansdale's most infamous operation involved a creature from Filipino mythology, a nightmare made flesh. The aswang. In Filipino folklore, it's a vampire-like creature that stalks the countryside at night, draining victims of their blood, leaving only pale, lifeless corpses. In rural Philippines, belief in the aswang was absolute, a superstition passed down through generations, whispered in the dark. Edward Lansdale saw an opportunity. A Hook squadron had set up camp on a hillside near a village. Lansdale brought in a combat psychological warfare squad with specific instructions. First, they spread rumors.
Villagers were told that an aswang had been spotted near the hill. The creature was hunting. It was hungry. Anyone on that hill, after dark, was in mortal danger. The rumors spread, from villagers to Huk sympathizers to the guerrillas themselves. Then, Lansdale's team set an ambush. When a Huk patrol came along a trail, the Americans silently captured the last man in the formation. They punctured his neck with 2 holes, vampire fashion, then held the body upside down by the heels and drained it of blood. The corpse was placed back on the trail. When dawn came and the Huk fighters discovered their comrade exsanguinated, puncture wounds on his neck, pale as death, panic tore through their ranks. The aswang was real. It had fed. And they were next. When daylight came, the entire Huk squadron abandoned their positions and fled the area. Not a single shot fired. 0 casualties on the American side. An entire enemy unit routed by superstition and theater. Lansdale defended his tactics bluntly. He believed psychological warfare required deep understanding of cultural beliefs. Exploit those beliefs, he argued, and you could defeat an enemy without conventional combat. The Hukbalahap rebellion officially ended in 1954 when their leader surrendered. Lansdale's psychological operations weren't the only factor, but they were devastating. His success in the Philippines made him a legend within intelligence circles. He later applied similar tactics in Vietnam, where his methods would inspire one of the most bizarre operations of that entire war.
February 10th, 1970. Fire Support Base Chamberlain, South Vietnam. Night falls over the jungle. And then, the voices begin. To Viet Cong soldiers, hidden in the jungle darkness, these sounds were unmistakable. The wandering souls of their dead comrades. Ghosts condemned to eternal suffering because their bodies were never recovered, never given proper burial. Vietnamese culture holds that if a person dies without proper burial in their homeland, their soul wanders aimlessly in pain and suffering. These beliefs ran deep, spiritual traditions maintained for centuries. And the U.S. Army weaponized them. Operation Wandering Soul was designed by the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion, building on lessons learned from Edward Lansdale. American engineers spent weeks in Saigon studios, recording distorted sounds and altered voices. South Vietnamese soldiers were recruited to add authenticity, their accents, their dialects, their cultural knowledge. The result was Ghost Tape Number 10. The recordings included cries of women and children, banging gongs, howling noises, voices of Viet Cong descendants, and iterations of the scariest ghosts in Vietnamese folklore, including the tightening knot ghost, which whispered "ko ko," Vietnamese for neck, intended to induce thoughts of suicide. The tapes were broadcast from multiple platforms. Swift boats patrolled rivers, blasting the sounds into the jungle. Helicopters flew low over suspected Viet Cong positions, speakers mounted externally. Special infantry units carried speaker systems strapped to their backs, infiltrating behind enemy lines to play the recordings from the trees themselves. The broadcasts typically began at 8 p.m. and continued all night long. The sounds were played so loudly they traveled through underground tunnel systems, where Viet Cong forces hid, making it impossible to escape the haunting voices. Reports of the operation's effectiveness vary wildly. In one incident, 150 Viet Cong soldiers abandoned a mountain position after hearing recordings that included tiger growls, another culturally specific fear. Other operations resulted in immediate defections and surrenders. But the tapes also had unintended consequences. Raymond Deitch, former commander of the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion, admitted the tapes were so effective they were instructed not to play them within earshot of South Vietnamese forces, who were equally susceptible. Friendly troops hearing the ghost voices would panic and open fire toward the speakers, believing they were genuinely haunted.
American forces reported that South Vietnamese soldiers demanded the broadcasts stop, terrified of angering the spirits of their own ancestors. The Viet Cong eventually realized what was happening. Leadership circulated warnings that the ghost sounds were American propaganda. When they identified speaker locations, they directed concentrated fire, revealing their hidden positions in the process. One former PSYOP officer noted that even when the enemy saw through the ruse, the tape still played on their anxieties about dying far from home, likely sapping morale. Rumors spread among Vietnamese civilians. Farmers refused to work near areas where the ghost tapes had been played. Villages developed reputations as haunted. The psychological impact rippled beyond military targets, an unintended consequence of weaponizing cultural belief. By the early 1970s, Operation Wandering Soul was discontinued, but its legacy endured, proof that fear, properly engineered, could be broadcast like artillery fire. The Korean War reignited America's commitment to psychological warfare. The establishment of the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in 1952 became the birthplace of U.S. Army Special Forces, creating a permanent home for unconventional warfare tactics. In 1952, the Army activated the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, which eventually evolved into the U.S. Army Special Warfare Center and School. This institutionalization meant that psychological operations were no longer ad hoc experiments, they were doctrine. Throughout the Cold War, PSYOP units refined their craft. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty broadcast Western propaganda behind the Iron Curtain. Civil affairs and information operations became standard components of military planning. But the Gulf War in 1991 would demonstrate psychological warfare's evolution into something unprecedented. Desert Storm began with a simple, devastating message dropped from the sky. Leaflets were dropped informing soldiers they would be bombed the next day by B-52 bombers, urging them to surrender and save their lives. The bombings followed precisely as promised, but calibrated to minimize casualties rather than maximize destruction. Then more leaflets fell. We kept our promise. Surrender now. Don't be next. The psychological impact was immense. Iraqi soldiers realized that they were facing an enemy that could strike with precision, that kept its word, that offered survival as an alternative to death. The results were staggering. During the Gulf War, PSYOP messages were credited for the surrender of 87,000 Iraqi soldiers, entire units that laid down arms without fighting, clutching leaflets that promised safe passage. Loudspeakers on the battlefield broadcast messages in Arabic. Radio stations hijacked Iraqi frequencies. Even Iraqi telephone networks were penetrated, commanders receiving calls urging surrender. Soldiers hearing voices that seemed to know their positions, their unit designations, their vulnerabilities.
The battlefield had become psychological before it became physical. March 2003. The concept that dominated pre-war coverage had a meme that sounded like a weapon itself: shock and awe. Officials described the plan as using overwhelming force to psychologically maim and break the will of the Iraqi army to fight. The idea was simple, but brutal. Hit so hard, so fast, so comprehensively, that resistance would collapse before it began. Harlan Ullman, one of the concept's architects, explained the strategy was designed to produce a state of physical, emotional, and psychological exhaustion within days. The campaign began with precision strikes on Baghdad, fires lighting up the night sky, explosions captured by embedded journalists and broadcast worldwide. The visual spectacle was part of the strategy. Demonstrate overwhelming capability. Make resistance seem futile. Millions of leaflets were dropped. Radio broadcasts amplified the perception of coalition invincibility. Media coverage became a weapon. But the effectiveness of shock and awe remains debated. Some Iraqi soldiers reported severe demoralization and lack of command, describing the invasion as not a war, but suicide. Others showed remarkable resilience, continuing daily routines even as bombs fell around them. The most visible image,
The toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad later sparked allegations it was carefully orchestrated by U.S. Army PSYOPS teams rather than a spontaneous celebration. What became clear was that psychological warfare had its limits. It could break armies, it could demoralize soldiers, but it couldn't substitute for political strategy or cultural understanding. The Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts revealed the boundaries of fear as a weapon, effective against conventional forces, less so against decentralized insurgencies driven by ideology rather than command structures. There's a question that haunts psychological warfare, a question without easy answers. When does strategy become manipulation? When does persuasion become terror? Where is the line? The Aswang operation in the Philippines involved kidnapping a human being, draining his blood, and staging his corpse as a supernatural murder to terrify enemy fighters. By any measure, it was a war crime disguised as innovation. Operation Wandering Soul weaponized grief and spiritual belief, exploiting the Vietnamese reverence for the dead to induce psychological trauma. The Ghost Army's deceptions saved lives by avoiding combat, but they also normalized the idea that truth is malleable, that reality itself can be manufactured for strategic purposes. Lieutenant Colonel R. Scott Rogers, who helped create PSYOP campaigns in Afghanistan, emphasized the importance of understanding target audiences' behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. The science of psychological operations now involves detailed cultural analysis, focus groups, longitudinal studies, methods borrowed from marketing and social psychology. Modern PSYOP is sophisticated. It uses social media, cyber operations, information campaigns. It's simultaneous, rapid, multimedia. The tools have evolved from leaflets and loudspeakers to algorithms and deepfakes, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Understand what someone fears, what they believe, what they value, and you can influence their decisions without ever confronting them directly. The fundamental mission has remained constant: to convey selected information to foreign audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The question is whether wielding fear as a weapon changes the wielder as much as the target. In a nondescript building at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, formerly Fort Bragg, soldiers train for a kind of warfare most people never see. They learn basic speaking and listening proficiency in foreign languages, military intelligence, advanced interpersonal communication, adaptive leadership, cultural analysis, and advanced social media and marketing. They're training to fight on the invisible battlefield. On October 1, 2006, PSYOP became an official branch within the United States Army. What began as an experimental World War I program is now a permanent, professionalized component of American military power. The units that carry out these operations, now called Military Information Support Operations to distance themselves from negative connotations, deploy to conflict zones worldwide. They broadcast messages, they drop leaflets, they run social media campaigns, they analyze cultural vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. The tools are different, the scale is different, but the objective is timeless. Win the battle for the mind, and you win the war. History's most effective weapons aren't always the ones that kill. Sometimes they're the ones that convince you to surrender before the fighting starts. The ones that make you question your cause, doubt your leaders, fear your fate. The ones that turn your own beliefs against you. The Ghost Army saved thousands of lives with rubber tanks and sound effects. Edward Lansdale ended a rebellion by staging a vampire attack. Operation Wandering Soul weaponized the voices of the dead. Shock and Awe broadcast American power to the entire world. Each operation had a singular insight at its core. Fear is a choice, and if you control the information someone receives, you control what they choose to fear. Today, psychological warfare continues in new forms: information operations, cyber warfare, influence campaigns on social media. The battlefield has expanded from jungles and deserts into the digital realm, where truth and fiction blur, where propaganda travels at the speed of light, where psychological operations can target entire populations simultaneously. The question we face now isn't whether psychological warfare works. History's answered that conclusively. The question is, when the entire information ecosystem becomes a battlefield, when every citizen is a potential target of psychological operations from their own government or foreign adversaries, what does that do to our ability to distinguish truth from manipulation? What happens when fear becomes ambient, constant, industrialized? The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were made honorary members of the U.S. Army Psychological Operations Regiment on November 3, 2022, a recognition that their art of deception laid the foundation for modern information warfare. They were artists who became warriors. They painted illusions that saved lives. They proved that imagination could be as powerful as firepower. But they also proved something darker: that human perception is fragile, that reality can be manufactured, that what you believe to be true can be engineered by someone who understands your fears better than you do. The most terrifying weapon isn't the one pointed at your body, it's the one pointed at your mind.